Welcome back to Haunted and Historic Australia for another episode of Criminals, Cutthroats and Convicts. In this episode, we take a look at the phenomena which was and still is the Monte Cristo. The Monte Cristo is a large mansion-like stately home that was built in 1885 in the town of Junee, which is close to Wagga Wagga in the Riverina area of New South Wales. The Monte Cristo is Australia's most haunted house, also they say. The most haunted house in Australia used to be Bungarraby House before it was demolished back in the mid-1900s. We've been to the homestead site and have a video on our channel about it. Unfortunately, the house no longer stands, so it can't really be the most haunted house anymore. But Monte Cristo has taken over that honour. I've been there myself with my best friend and we took so many photos. We had a very interrupted sleep that night when we slept in one of the bedrooms upstairs. I'll tell you a bit more about our encounters later, but let's start at the beginning. It was built by a man named Christopher Crawley. Christopher Crawley was born in Sydney to Irish parents in 1841. His parents had immigrated to Australia. They were William and Ellen Crawley. It is believed that Christopher worked as a farmhand, and when he was 22, he met a lady by the name of Elizabeth Carr. In 1862, they were married in Tumut, but moved to Junee shortly afterwards. Originally, Christopher had 2 parcels of land on conditional purchase, 400 acres and 120 acres, where they built a primitive slab. When they first moved to Junee, they lived in a small brick cottage on the land of where the current Monte Cristo is. The homestead in which they originally lived before they were able to build the Monte Cristo became the kitchen and servant quarters later on. The conditional part of having this land was that someone could buy parcels of land at about £1 an acre on the proviso that they worked the land. So they had to farm the land that they purchased. They struggled with farming the land. Perhaps it wasn't good soil or something like that. They just weren't able to really make much of a living. However, Christopher Crawley acquired a licence and was still able to build a railway hotel in 1877. Christopher Crawley had friends in high places as he got word that the Great Southern Railway line would open in 1878. He must have had this knowledge before building the hotel, and sure enough, the railway was put in, and this made Christopher Crawley very wealthy, as when the railway line was put in, it brought a lot of people through, people to the area where he had a hotel. At the time that the railway was put through, there was only the hotel and a railway store that was owned by a George Dobbins, as well as a few slab houses and bark huts. But after the railway was put in, many travellers and people for agricultural trade came through. His land holdings increased and he owned almost the entire area of Junee at that time. He was very well regarded in the community and donated a parcel of land to a church, helping the construction of St. Joseph's Church and also building a slab hut for stables and to house Crawley's prized racehorses. Also building the dairy and a wood ballroom, which stands directly behind the old homestead. Christopher Crawley sold the railway hotel in 1884, retiring, and with this money meant that he was able to build onto the Monte Cristo to make it the extraordinary place that it is today, moving from the simple slab hut into the stately sized home that it is. Now, Elizabeth was a strong woman, usually always being seen in a black lace dress. As they came into money, they hired staff to look after their grand home, and they had many children. There was quite a lot of rumours around that Mrs. Crawley wasn't very nice to the servants and to the staff, especially after one of the nannies carrying her 10-month-old daughter Ethel dropped her down the stairs. At 69 years old, Christopher Crawley died at the home. He died due to blood poisoning caused by an infected sore on his neck. Elizabeth Crawley only left the home twice after the husband's death, dying there also in 1933 and died of heart failure. Before she died, she turned an upstairs storage room into a chapel where she would read the Bible for hours. Now it is believed that the home went abandoned for some time after the Crawley children had grown up. It is not known whether or not they left the house due to spooky happenings, but there are a lot of rumours of death and horrible situations that occurred at the property while the Crawleys owned it. On the 3rd of June 1963, Reginald Ryan bought the Monte Cristo off the children of the Crawleys. The house had been vacant since 1943 and had been quite vandalised as nobody was living in it at that time. Possibly the Crawley children wanted out, and it may have had some horrible memories for them, especially losing their sister down the stairs. Another rumour was that one of the servants had been messing around with Christopher Crawley and became pregnant with his baby. It is rumoured that she fell from the balcony above the stairs leading up to the front door. Apparently, she had been pushed by Mrs. Crawley to her death. But the Ryans bought the house not knowing about its sinister past. Reginald Ryan bought the house because he fell in love with it. Passing the house many times, loved the style, but he bought the home for £1,000 and had to restore it to what it is today. Reginald Ryan and his wife Olive put the house back together and lived there with their young family. They had quite a few children, and some of the girls remember seeing Mrs. Crawley while they were growing up in the Monte Cristo. There are many supernatural stories that the Ryans have told about their time living there, and they still live there, actually. Their youngest son, Lawrence, lives there with his wife. The Ryans were running ghost tours from the 1990s and told of some chilling stories about what they'd experienced to the guests who arrived. There was also a time where ABC filmed there and had mediums come into the house and talk about what they felt. So many stories, as well as our experiences there. There's just so much to say about the Monte Cristo. But let's go back to the Crawleys and what was happening while they were living there that may have caused the house to be so haunted. So we know that Christopher Crawley died at the property, as well as Elizabeth Crawley. We know they had a daughter, Ethel, who was dropped in the stairwell to her death by one of the nannies. But apparently when the nanny was interviewed by police afterwards, she claimed that a force had pushed her. But this would have been before any deaths on the property. So what could have pushed the nanny in order to drop the daughter? That's really strange. Could there have been hauntings on this land before the Crawleys built here? The mind boggles. It also leads us to one of the women working there, a maid or servant, being thrown from the balcony onto the stairs that lead up to the front of the property. Apparently, she was pushed from the balcony down, and it is very heavily rumoured or thought to have been Mrs. Crawley, after Mrs. Crawley finding or hearing about information that the servant was pregnant with Mr. Crawley's baby. Now, there's a story that goes along with this, being that when the woman was pushed onto the stairs below, she bled over the stairs and the blood was not able to be cleaned from the stairs, or it took them some time to clean the blood off. How sinister. So the house has that going for it so far. But there's other things that happened as well. There's also the story about one of the servants who worked for Mrs. Crawley had a son with a mental illness. He was disabled so much that he would need to have been put into a facility. Perhaps the woman couldn't afford, or there was no facility around at the time she could put him into, but sadly she chained him in the dairy for 40 years. His name was apparently Harold Steele, and after Mrs. Crawley had passed on and the children had left the property, the woman was allowed to stay in the property and at some point died, and nobody noticed for some time. And when they did find the servant's body, her son Harold had still been chained in the dairy, and when he was found in such a terrible state, they transferred him to a hospital where he died later. Terrible. They were so barbaric in these days when it came to people with any kind of mental illness or any kind of behavioural difficulties. What a place the Monte Cristo was. You could just imagine how thrilled people would be to get an invite to go and stay at this place after all these goings on and rumours in town of killings and deaths and people pushing people downstairs and dropping kids, people being chained up in dairies for 40 years. What a lovely place. But the thing is, it is a beautiful place. I know when I went there, I was taken back by how large and stately it was. The Ryans had done a great job of furnishing the place after most likely the Crawleys' furniture was either sold or vandalised. But what a beautiful place it was. It's hard to imagine anything sinister or awful could have even happened there, let alone death and murder. Coupled with the servants being treated badly, so much went on at the Monte Cristo to build up some negative energy, which is probably why it's so paranormal and so, as the mediums put it, evil. Another of the hideous stories that come along with the Monte Cristo was a young man named Morris, who worked at the Monte Cristo and slept in the stables. He had a bit of a rough boss, like most of us have encountered in our lives. There's that boss that just doesn't take any of your excuses, even if they're not excuses. You ring up sick and they say, all right, okay. Like they don't believe a word you're saying, even if you're legit. Well, Morris had a boss like this. And unfortunately for Morris, it meant his death. He complained in the morning that he wasn't feeling well, and this boss didn't believe him and told him to get out of the bed. Morris didn't move and still complained, so the boss decided to light a match and put it on the straw mattress that he lay upon. Morris was sick and couldn't get up out of the bed, so you can guess where this went. Poor Morris was burned alive in his bed. One of the mediums that the ABC brought in the 90s, who had not heard that story, apparently knew that some foul murder had occurred with fire in the stables. And that wasn't even the last story, and probably this next one isn't the last either around that time of the Crawleys. There are more likely so many more that we don't know about that happened that just didn't make it out of those beautiful stained glass doors at the front. We all like Alfred Hitchcock. We love many of his movies, and one man liked it more than others. He went and saw Psycho when it came out in Australia, probably in the 1960s, before the Ryans bought the house. What happened was some crazy man who'd seen Psycho 3 times decided he was going to reenact some of the story, and he went to the Monte Cristo with the intention of murdering someone. And he found poor Jack Simpson, the caretaker, who was still working there when the Crawley family still had it. He found Jack in the dairy and shot him dead. And the words, "Die, Jack, ha ha," still scratched into the wall of the dairy. And that's just the stories of when the Crawleys were living there. There's more stories from the Ryan family after they moved in, and as I said earlier, the daughters were seeing Mrs. Crawley at various times throughout the home. It all started at the beginning when they'd first moved in. Only 3 days into them moving into the property, they arrived one evening and the property didn't have electricity, nor did it have windows. Yet, light was illuminating from various windows within the house. They couldn't explain it. There was no electricity. It cannot have been the headlights reflecting off panes of glass when there wasn't any. It had been vandalised so badly that there wasn't any glass left in the windows. Very odd. They weren't the only people to have seen it. The next couple of days, they were asked questions from the people in town as to why they had so much light illuminating from the house. The Ryans tell of stories of not being able to have pets in the home simply because they wouldn't go in. And other times, some pets met a dreadful end, so they really couldn't keep any at the home. Many of the children had sleepless nights while living in the house and strange dreams. A piano could be heard being played within the house, yet there was no piano when the Ryans moved in. Not only had Mrs. Crawley been seen by some of the girls in the house, but also a lady in white who floats along the ceiling and out her window. Also, her head can be seen floating by itself. And another guest swears that they saw the lady in white at the top of the stairs and she told them that everything was going to be okay. Wow. It seems that everybody who comes into contact with the Monte Cristo has a very strange experience. There has been many that said nothing happened at all, but I'm pretty certain stuff happens around that house, and if you're not in tune with it or you're skeptical about things, you won't notice it as much as someone who's more open. People often see Mrs. Crawley in windows and mirrors. Some have even been able to take photos of this. It is claimed that a young boy who visited the Monte Cristo with his mother was walking around and noticed a man following them. As a young boy, he probably just figured it was someone part of the group, as often the tour groups have quite a few people, and it's obvious you don't know everybody. But the boy after the tour said to his mother, "How come that old man dressed in the brown clothes with the beard is following us everywhere?" The mother turned around and there was nobody in the tour who looked like this. It wasn't just the Ryans who had stories to tell, but others in the neighbourhood have also come forward over the decades to state that they'd seen lights coming from the house at different times of the night. Sometimes it looked as though someone was carrying a lantern on the balcony, and many stating they'd seen people walking on the balcony, and they weren't the people in the Ryan family, and they weren't the members of the Ryan family. Another thing that the ABC mediums and film crew noticed while they were filming at the location was that smoke coming from the dining area where they'd been eating was going up into the sky and then being sucked into the chimney at the dairy. Yet no one could explain how this phenomena could have happened. Not to mention the countless stories that guests and visitors have said happened to them while they were staying. One man hadn't even gotten out of his car in the car park at the Monte Cristo before something had latched onto him. Later on, it was still on his chest at home, and he went weeks with it being stuck to him, even going to the doctor and the doctor clearing him, saying that there wasn't anything wrong with him and perhaps he needed an exorcism. But one night, while laying in bed, he felt the pain around his chest area disappear. He looked over to his wife, who was awake and looking rather frightened in bed. They looked up to the ceiling, and clinging to the wall beside the light switch was a black figure. Technology has come a long way over the past decades, and a lot of ghost hunters like ourselves have wanted to go to the Monte Cristo and film, and back in 2010 a group did, and they got an EVP where when they were asking for anyone to communicate, someone said, "Pick me." They also were said to have captured the sound of Mrs. Crawley ordering them to get out of the house, and a lot of bangs echoing throughout the house. Which brings us to our encounters in 2012. Unfortunately, at the time I wasn't doing a channel and I wasn't filming, but we did get some rather interesting photos. And the encounters that we had were very strange. We were there with a group, and others in the group said they didn't feel or see anything the whole time they were there. At the end of the tour, we walked out the front door and down the steps to go around the back of the property. As we walked down those first steps, where the woman had been pushed to her death, my best friend and I laughed and said, "Oh, I wonder if there's something there." To our surprise, We turned around, took a photo, and when we looked at the photo we'd just taken, we couldn't believe what was on it. It appeared to be a mist-like cloud hanging over the stairs, exactly where the woman had fallen. There was nobody smoking in the group, and it was too much smoke or mist to have been our breath, despite it being winter. It was frightfully cold. But we were the last two in the tour group to walk from the stairs. We can't explain it. It's got to be something, though. In the sleeping quarters, or lack of sleeping quarters as it was, we had a corner room, and in this corner room, where I had a little single bed, above me was a triangular shape of the ceiling where it went downward, where a window was, and above me on the ceiling that was quite close to my face as it sloped down were many scratches, like someone had been scratching at the ceiling incessantly for hours. Apart from that, my best friend and I, while sharing the room, noticed a creaking sound, and the wardrobe creaked slightly open. It was an older style wardrobe, and it freaked us out. As well as this, around 2 o'clock in the morning, we were woken to hear a scratching or dragging sound that was coming from outside the property. It sounded as though a hessian sack was being dragged along gravel around this kind of corner of the house where our bedroom was, which is quite strange because on the grounds outside our room is predominantly grass, with only the smallest little path. Could it be that something from maybe 100 years ago, when it wasn't so much grass, was being dragged around? Or were the people at the Monte Cristo trying to scare us? The next morning when I told the staff what had happened, they'd never had anyone experience that before. How strange. And it was 2 o'clock in the morning. Would they really need to go to those lengths, I wonder? Probably not. The place is clearly haunted. The blinds in the windows were pulled down. And I tell you what, had they not been pulled down, I don't think I could have slept at all in that house. As it was, I stayed awake until about 5 o'clock in the morning when the lights started to kind of come in. And I fell asleep for about an hour, maybe 2 hours or 3 hours the whole night. It was definitely an experience that I'll never forget. And to be honest, although it freaked us out, we can't wait to go back. Call us suckers for punishment, but this time I definitely want to go back. I'm dragging Mitch with me and we'll definitely film because it's going to be epic. We hope you enjoyed the episode on the Monte Cristo. We're definitely going to go back to the Monte Cristo and this time film everything. But stay tuned, we've got more upcoming adventures and always more criminals, cutthroats and convicts.